Well, former President Donald Trump winning the New Hampshire primary Tuesday with nearly 55% of the vote, bringing the nation a step closer to a rematch between President Biden and former President Trump later this year. A second Trump presidential term could bring the U.S. back into an era of protectionism. And if that were the case, domestic steel, aluminum, and lumber companies might win big. For more on this, we turn to Brian Gardner, who's the Stifel chief Washington policy strategist and Yahoo Finance columnist, Rick Newman. Great to have you both here with us today. Rick and Brian, as we're kind of continuing to evaluate this, one of the larger overhangs is the fact that even in international policy previously, we still haven't had some of those purchase agreements be followed through on now, whether that's because of the pandemic that ensued, in the timing leading up to the election, all of these things. There is still a larger question of what would be the U.S.'s stance internationally here. And Brian, I'll go to you first on this.
Sure. So, if it is Donald Trump who wins the 2024 election, then, I think the platform is pretty clear that they are a Trump administration would go forward on expanding the tariffs. And I think enforcement of the tariff mechanisms would become more of a focal point, whether it was because of the pandemic, whether the Biden administration was preoccupied with other matters. The follow through on those agreements going back to the Trump 1.0 administration hasn't been robust. So I think you're going to see a much more aggressive follow through on previous agreements and really stepping them up, not just vis-a-vis China, but across the rest of the world.
Brian, do you think Trump is at this point pretty much a sure bet here for the GOP nomination?
Oh, the party's over. Turn out the light. The party's over. It is done. It really was finished back in the spring. The moment that the Manhattan DA walked out with the first prosecution, I think you can, especially in retrospect, but we can say that the GOP race ended on that day. They went through the machinations, but it was over then.
Rick, do you agree with what Brian's saying? And I think also just taking it a step further, do you see the GOP party rallying behind a Trump nomination?
Right. Yeah, Brian's right. Unless there is a health issue with Trump, he will be the nominee. And I think he will be the nominee even if he is convicted in one of these trials that's underway. It's not clear we'll even get to a trial by the time of the convention over the summer or even Election Day. But I think, as Brian pointed out, he becomes more popular with Republicans through all these prosecutions. There were some warning signs for Trump, though, in New Hampshire, which point to some things that are going to come up in the general election. He lost independents in New Hampshire by almost a 2-to-1 ratio. And independents, particularly in about 6 or 7 swing states, are crucial voters. Now, they voted for Nikki Haley for the most part last night. That does not automatically mean that Joe Biden would get those voters in a Trump-Biden rematch. So this is kind of a familiar problem for Trump, which is that he has devotional support among his base, but he has very shaky support among independents, suburban women and voters like that, who are pretty likely to decide the race. So the whole question, similar to in 2020, is Trump's base enough to put him over the top? And that's very much an open question.
Brian, layered onto that, you had a lot of Wall Street power that was thrown behind Nikki Haley. Does that automatically shift over to Trump? Or if he is convicted on any of these cases on the criminal front, do some of the Wall Street dollars, donors, the super PACs, do they say, okay, we're going to prioritize perhaps maybe not voting for Biden, but put some of the money towards other down ballot campaigns that are being run to make sure that there's still logjam in Washington?
It's a great question. I don't think you can paint with too broad of a brush. A lot of kind of Republican money, Wall Street money, will go to Trump for now. If there is a conviction, and I totally agree with Rick, I'm very skeptical we're going to get a conviction before the election. The timing is just too complicated, and that's a separate conversation. But if there were, in that hypothetical, there were to be a conviction, then sure, there'll be some hedging of bets, shifting money to down ballot races. maybe just holding back to, dry powder, see how it plays out after a conviction to see what happens next, and maybe shift back to Trump after that. Maybe they decide that that voters are still behind him and that he has a chance and that they're going to want a seat at the table come January of 2025. So, I think, yes, in the short term, you'll see a shift over to Trump. It's already happening. Longer term, if there is a conviction, maybe keep the powder dry and then deploy it depending on how the situation evolves.
Rick,
Hey guys, I would add to that.
go ahead.
I don't take for granted that Trump would necessarily be better for markets. So just to get into the details a wee bit, Trump does want to impose 10% tariffs on virtually all imports, and he wants to decouple the U.S. economy from China, not just fend off the U.S. economy in certain areas, which Biden has done, such as semiconductors, electric vehicle components and stuff like that. Trump wants to decouple the U.S. economy from China. Now, who knows how far he would go, but despite everything that's happened with regard to China, we still do a ton of trade with China, and trade both directions, imports and exports, is almost at the highest levels it's ever been with China. Big changes on taxes are coming too, but I don't automatically assume that Trump would be better for the markets than Biden.
All right.
I think just one quick. I think there's a trade the day after the election, but I agree with Rick. Longer term, that natural reaction that Trump would be better for the markets. I think investors are going to have a lot to absorb if Trump is elected, not just the day after, but going forward after that.
Yeah, certainly breaking down the policies, exactly where it's going to impact, and not to mention some of the movement that we've seen in some of those meme stock plays too, as it looks like Trump will solidify his lead there as the GOP nomination here as we count down to the election. All right, Brian Gardner, always great to have you, and of course, Rick Newman, thanks so much for taking the time, guys.